Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. We're going to give everybody a minute to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar.
Okay, welcome to Huron's second of two webinars covering the FDA's notices of proposed rulemaking. Today's webinar is focused on the FDA NPRM on collaborative research. And I would like to introduce our speakers. I'm Brandy Stuffle. I will try to advance our slides here. I'm an associate at Huron. We also have Tom Becker, who is a director at Huron, and Michael Hill, who is a senior associate. Today, we'll be covering an overview of the NPRM, a summary of the proposed cooperative research changes, first impressions, which we'll have some polling questions, and next steps. Some housekeeping items. We have everyone on mute, so if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll also be launching polling questions throughout the webinar, so please do respond to those as they pop up, and we'll share those results in real time. If you have a technology or other question not directly related to the webinar, feel free to use the chat function. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Brandy. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. If you can go on to the next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about the timeline. How did we get here? Looking all the way back, we see the common rule and FDA regulations that were codified by HHS in 1991. Then we saw our first guidance from the FDA regarding the use of a single IRB published in 2006. And then, as most of us will recall, we kind of moved into a period where we had anticipated changes to modernize the common rule. 2016, we saw the publish of the 21st Century Cures Act, which charged the FDA with harmonizing their regulations with those changes to the common rule. And then 2018, we had our first real major single IRB policy, which was published by the NIH, which required NIH-funded research to utilize that single IRB review. And then in 2020, excuse me, in 2020, we saw the HHS Cooperative Research provisions go into effect, which required all federally funded, non-exempt research to utilize a single IRB. And that leads us up to today with these two notices of proposed rulemaking published by the FDA. Excuse me. Sorry, excuse me. So in support of the charge for harmonization with HHS, the FDA has released two notices of proposed rulemaking. The first NPRM for human subjects research primarily addresses changes to informed consent elements, some continuing review requirements, and includes additions and modifications to certain definitions. We previously reviewed this on a webinar, and that will be made available on our website soon. Today, we're going to focus our talk on the second NPRM, which focuses on cooperative research. The major elements of this NPRM are the requirement to rely on a single IRB by sites that are participating in research subject to FDA regulations and proposed record-keeping requirements for institutions relying on a single IRB. Excuse me, my voice. Actually, yes, move on to the next slide. So not part of our discussion today, but we wanted to call your attention to a couple of other FDA publications. A recent draft guidance was published for ethical considerations for clinical investigations of medical products involving children. This guidance provides insight into FDA's current thinking about the use of drugs, biologics, and devices in children. This draft document covers important ethical issues such as the requirement of scientific necessity and risk assessment for categories involving children. We would encourage you to review this document and provide feedback, which is currently open for comment until December 27th. Also, we call attention to 2018 NPRM that was published by the FDA, which addresses IRB waivers and alterations of informed consent for minimal risk clinical investigation. This NPRM would permit waivers and alterations of certain elements of informed consent to put it closer in alignment with the common rule. This NPRM hasn't moved on to a final rule, but the current NPRM does actually include a reference to this document. And finally, I just want to address the applicability that we're talking about today. So the timeline that we saw a few minutes ago referenced the initial NIH single IRB policy that was published. However, as we know, the scope of the revised common rule actually sort of engulfs the NIH policy. So we will focus our talk today specifically on how the NPRM applies to HHS policies. Apologies for my voice going in and out. And on that note, I'll pass it over to Tom.
Thanks, Michael. In this next section, I will provide an overview of some of the more impactful proposed changes in the FDA's NPRM on cooperative research. So to Michael's point from earlier, we're really just honing in on the cooperative research NPRM today. Brandy, if you could advance to the next slide. So we're gonna follow a similar approach to our last webinar on common rule harmonization. So in the interest of time, we'll really focus in on the specific changes that are more likely to be impactful to you and your IRBs and human research protection programs with respect to policies and procedures, processes, electronic systems, things like that. So with that in mind, in this next section, I'll hone in on several specific changes from the cooperative research NPRM, and I'll parse them out. I'll provide a brief overview of some of the NPRM's proposed changes around when single IRB review is required, the exceptions to that requirement. I'll cover those as well, which will be important because they differ in a number of ways from the single IRB requirements you may be familiar with from the revised common rule or from NIH policy. I'll cover the proposed changes to IRB record keeping requirements related to single IRB review, and I'll provide some side-by-side comparisons between the common rule and FDA NPRM regulatory language related to single IRB review as well. And for those of you who attended the previous webinar, we'll follow a similar approach where we'll provide some excerpts of the proposed regulatory changes on several of the slides that follow in this section, and to compare and contrast the current FDA regulations from the proposed new regulations. I'll be using color-coded text to make those proposed changes more clear, kind of like a track changes format in Microsoft Word. We'll use green text to indicate any proposed newly added text, red text to indicate any proposed deletions from the prior regulatory text, and any items in gray, including text that has moved from one location to another. So we can move to the next slide here, and we'll start out here by taking a look at the proposed new regulatory change from the NPRM for section 114 of the IRB, the FDA's IRB regulations at 21 CFR 56, the section on cooperative research. And as you can see from the stricken out text here, the current FDA regulatory language on cooperative research states that in complying with these regulations, institutions involved in multi-institutional studies may use joint review, reliance upon the review of another qualified IRB, or similar arrangements aimed at avoidance of duplication of effort. As you can see from the green text also added, the FDA is really proposing some new language here. First, they provide more information on the intended meaning behind the term cooperative research by stating that cooperative research covered by these regulations is a clinical investigation that involves more than one institution. In the conduct of cooperative research, each institution is responsible for safeguarding the rights and welfare of human subjects and for complying with these regulations. And then perhaps a bit more significantly, they also add the following in the proposed new section B1, stating that any institution located in the United States that is participating in cooperative research must rely upon approval by a single IRB for that portion of the research that is conducted in the United States. So really, we're going from may to must here if these changes eventually take effect. And so that's really at the heart of the changes that the FDA is proposing in this NPRM. If we could go to the next slide, we'll just continue the overview here. As always, when considering regulatory language, it's important to be aware of key terms that have a specific definition or description in the regulations, as well as terms that are not officially defined, and that's important in the context of this, in the context of cooperative research for this NPRM as well. So when we consider the proposed new requirement that any institution located in the United States participating in cooperative research must rely on approval by a single IRB, we need to be aware of a couple of key terms that we've underlined here for emphasis: cooperative research and the term participating. As we have seen already in the previous slide, this NPRM describes cooperative research as a clinical investigation that involves more than one institution. And that description of cooperative investigation also uses the term clinical investigation, which of course is a defined term in the regulations. And that definition isn't changing under this proposed NPRM, but just a reminder here that that term clinical investigation does vary a bit between the IRB regulations at Part 56 and the investigational drug regulations at Part 312 and the investigational device regulations at Part 812. And importantly here, this new description of cooperative research also uses the term participating, but it doesn't define the term participating. FDA indicates in the NPRM language that this was a deliberate choice, that the use of the word participating better reflects the terminology used throughout the FDA's existing human research protections regulations. And at first glance, this might not sound particularly problematic, but remember that for some multi-site research, the roles and responsibilities among participating sites might vary. And remember that the FDA also does not have a concept of engagement in research in the way that DHHS regulated research does within the common rule and via guidance provided by OHARP. So for DHHS regulated research, OHARP guidance provides us with scenarios for when an institution's role in research rises to the level of being engaged and requiring IRB oversight or not. But as of right now, there is no analogous requirement that exists for FDA regulated research. And so by not defining the term participating, it could lead to some confusion in the future for participating institutions whose roles in the research might be really limited. So we'll talk about this particular issue a little bit more a little bit later in this section of the webinar. I'm going to actually pause here for a moment, and I'm going to launch a polling question just to get some first impressions from you all on what you're hearing from the webinar so far, particularly on this requirement. And in particular, I want to hear your sort of gut reactions so far about how impactful you think this change may be to your program if it were to take effect. So let me go ahead and launch our first poll here. So the question is, how impactful would the FDA's proposed cooperative research requirements be for your institution's FDA-regulated research portfolio? Do you think it would have a major impact because none of your FDA-regulated cooperative research is utilizing external or single IRBs? Would it have a moderate impact because most of your FDA research is already utilizing external IRBs? Would it have a minor impact? Would have a minor impact because most of your FDA-regulated research is already using external IRBs, unlike the moderate impact option? Or would it have no impact at all? So I'm just going to wait here a few seconds to let the results come through here before I end and share. It looks like the responses are slowing down here, so I'll go ahead and end and share the results. And hopefully you can all see this up on your screens. It sounds like the majority of the respondents feel like this is likely to have a moderate impact on your program, meaning most of your FDA regulated cooperative research isn't currently utilizing external IRBs. The next most popular response being a fairly minor impact, with a few people feeling that this may have a major impact on their programs as well. So thanks for your participation there. We'll continue on with the polls in the next section here, but I will go ahead and continue on with the next few slides and continuing to parse out some of this language before we get into some additional polls here. So we've covered the new single IRB review requirement in general, but the FDA's Cooperative Research NPRM also includes some important exceptions to the single IRB requirement, and we're going to talk about those exceptions in more detail in the next few slides. One high-level thing for everyone to be aware of here is that the NIH single IRB policy and the revised common rule single IRB requirement both have exceptions to their rule too, but know that the FDA's exceptions are mostly different from the other requirements. The FDA proposes to add the following language shown on this slide, stating that cooperative research wouldn't be subject to the single IRB review requirement unless one of the following criteria were met. The first exception that they list is for cooperative research for which more than single IRB review is required by a law, including tribal law passed by the official governing body of an American Indian or Alaska Native tribe. This exception is essentially identical to one of the exceptions in the single IRB requirement in the revised common rule. So since this one should already feel relatively familiar, we don't plan to unpack this one too much further in today's webinar, but we'll focus in more on the second, third, and fourth exceptions here. So the second exception is for cooperative research involving a highly specialized FDA-regulated medical product for which unique localized expertise is required. The third exception is for cooperative research on drugs that meets the exemption from an investigational new drug application under 312B, or cooperative, in the fourth exception, cooperative research on medical devices that meets the abbreviated requirements or that meets the requirements for exempted investigations under the investigational device regulations. So the second, third, and fourth exceptions as currently proposed would be unique to the FDA regulations if they were implemented. So we'll devote some time to parsing those out individually. But before I do that, I do want to point out one last piece of proposed regulatory language shown here at the bottom of this slide, which would be section 114C of the proposed new regulations. So in the case Of any of these 4 exceptions, the NPRM goes on to clarify that even though there's no requirement for single IRB review under these exceptions, institutions still may enter into reliance or joint agreements if they choose to do so. So in other words, use of single IRB review may not be required for these exceptions, but it would still be permitted if an organization chose to do so. And this is important for cases involving research that might be subject to both FDA and common rule requirements. The NPRM language explains that there may be cases where such studies could fit within a proposed exception from the FDA's proposed requirements for use of single IRB review, but may still be required under the revised common rule to use single IRB review, which would still be permissible based on this additional proposed language in the regulations. So trying to avoid any conflict there with the revised common rule requirements. If we could jump to the next slide, thank you. We'll consider each of those 3 exceptions that were unique to the FDA regulations, or would be unique to the FDA regulations if they are eventually implemented. So we'll look at that second exception first. So in the case of the exception for research involving highly specialized medical products, the FDA is essentially acknowledging with this exception that there really may be certain scenarios where a local site truly does have important local expertise that is only readily available locally, and that there may be scenarios where that local site may not be in a position to be the IRB of record, or may not be selected as the IRB of record if they weren't careful with applying these exceptions. The FDA has indicated in the NPRM that it believes that mandating the use of single IRB review could be an obstacle in certain circumstances to initiating important research if localized expertise is readily available but can't be used because that local institution isn't the IRB of record. So, essentially to avoid that, which the FDA believes would be a very rare exception, they've still incorporated this exception into the proposed NPRM. If we could jump to the next slide, I'll talk about that third exception, which was for cooperative research on drugs that meets the exemptions from an IND under the FDA's investigational new drug regulations at 21 CFR 312. So the FDA states that such studies are generally lower risk clinical investigations of products that are already lawfully marketed. The FDA indicates in the NPRM that unlike clinical investigations that are conducted under IND requirements, it's the FDA's opinion that increased efficiencies leading to earlier initiation of clinical investigations exempt from IND requirements generally wouldn't provide the benefit of bringing new drugs or new uses of drugs to market sooner. So essentially the rationale here is that most research that's exempt from an IND requirement isn't focused on bringing new drugs to market. The purpose behind the single IRB requirement is to help facilitate the effort to bring new drugs to market faster. Since this category of research isn't bringing new drugs to market faster, we don't want it to be subject to the single IRB requirement, not necessarily. There's a little bit of a similar rationale with the fourth exception as well. So if we want to jump to the next slide, I'll unpack that fourth exception a little bit more here as well. So the proposed updated regulatory language for this fourth exception, remember, states that it is for cooperative research on medical devices that meets the abbreviated requirements under the chapter on investigational device exemptions. In other words, abbreviated IDEs or non-significant risk IDEs, or that meets the requirements of exempted investigations under the investigational device exemption requirements. The NPRM indicates that this proposed exception would encompass research that presents lower risks to subjects and in certain circumstances may not involve therapeutic interventions or invasive procedures. The proposed exemption would encompass research that isn't focused on bringing new devices to the market for patients, again, similar to the exception for IND exempt drug studies. And therefore, the FDA believes that the initial administrative burden of establishing cooperative review agreements in the first place may not be offset by any anticipated benefits of single IRB review, such as improvement in the review and handling of safety reports or faster initiation of research that facilitates the development of new medical products. So let's jump to the next slide here and continue to talk about a couple of other proposed changes to the FDA regulations. So the FDA has also in this NPRM added some proposed new language in section 115 of the regulations on IRB record keeping. So this is the section of the IRB, the FDA's IRB regulations that lists out the kinds of records that an IRB needs to maintain to ensure adequate documentation of its activities. And the Cooperative Research NPRM proposes the addition of a new requirement here. It proposes the addition of a requirement, as indicated in the text on the screen here, to include documentation specifying the institution's reliance on an external IRB for oversight of the research and the responsibilities that each entity will undertake to ensure compliance with the requirements of this part. Note that this proposed provision is consistent with the added revised common rule requirements around IRB record keeping as well. And the FDA has indicated in the NPRM text that this proposed requirement is necessary for documenting compliance with Part 56 to provide records for the FDA's oversight and for compliance purposes as well. So some additional requirements around record keeping here. And so to summarize on this slide in the next, the proposed new record keeping requirements, just note that these record keeping requirements would be consistent with the revised common rule. Also note that the IRB record retention requirements here would be for 3 years, including reliance documentation, same as the revised common rule. So institutions must retain documentation of their reliance agreements, and documentation must specify the responsibilities that each entity will undertake to ensure compliance with these regulations. If we jump to the next slide, we'll just make a few key points here on some additional proposed new language. So while there's some specifics offered with regard to implementing this new record keeping requirement if it were to take effect, just note that there are some important areas where further clarification might actually be helpful for those of us managing and overseeing human research protection programs. So while the NPRM does provide some examples of the kinds of records that they might expect to see, like written agreements between institutions and reviewing IRBs, or things like institution-wide policy directives that allocate responsibilities between institutions and unaffiliated IRBs, or as set forth in research protocols. The NPRM and the proposed regulatory changes are also silent on a few potentially important points. So the FDA, the NPRM is silent on the type of agreements that would need to be used, and it's also silent on any specific language that must be included in such agreements as well. So there may potentially be a need here for some additional clarification, or at a minimum, the human research protections community may be hungry for some additional clarification here as well to ensure compliance with this point in the future if these proposed changes take effect. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to do some side-by-side comparisons here of the common rule language and the FDA NPRM language on the topic of cooperative research. First, we'll summarize some of the key differences in terminology and definitions that we discussed earlier. So with the HHS or common rule definitions on the left and the proposed FDA changes on the right, we see one of the early changes in the terminology being used related to cooperative research, with the FDA focusing in on the term engagement, or sorry, with the common rule focusing in on the term engaged or engagement, and the FDA regulations utilizing that term participating. While the term engaged isn't a defined term in the common rule regulations, there is at least guidance that has been provided by OHARP, including a number of specific scenarios indicating examples of when organizations are or are not engaged. And again, that guidance is specific to OHARP. FDA does not recognize that term engagement the way OHARP and the common rule regulations do. And so importantly here, the term participating, which the FDA utilizes, is not a defined term in the FDA regulations, nor is there any existing guidance on that topic. One last point here in terms of definitions to compare and contrast. The common rule regulations use the term projects when describing cooperative research projects covered by this policy involving more than one institution, while the FDA uses the term clinical investigation, which is the term they use for consistency, since that is essentially a term that, while the definitions vary slightly, does appear consistently across the FDA regulations. If we can jump into the next slide here, I'll also summarize the differences in the kinds of exceptions to the single IRB review requirement between the common rule and the FDA NPRM. So both the common rule and the FDA NPRM share one identical exception. That's the first one highlighted here, the exception for cooperative research for which more than single IRB review is required by law. And then after that, the two have differing sets of exceptions after that. The common rule regulations include an exception for research for which any federal department or agency supporting or conducting the research determines and documents that the use of a single IRB is not appropriate for this particular context. Note that the FDA in general neither supports nor conducts research, which is their stated rationale for not including a similar exception in the FDA regulations. Rather, the FDA has those three exceptions that we covered on our previous slides: the exception for highly specialized FDA regulated medical products requiring unique local expertise, the exception for research on drugs that's exempt from IND requirements, and the fourth exception for device research that's either IDE exempt or represents non-significant risk devices. Moving into the next slide here. So in these last couple of slides for this section, I'll just review some of the potential impacts as we see it to the human research protections community for these proposed changes. In terms of the differing requirements and terminology between FDA and the common rule, we think it's going to be important to know how this term participating will come to be defined and applied. Could it be related to whether or not the site investigator needs to be listed on an FDA 1572, for example? Will activities that will not rise to the level of being engaged in DHHS research be considered participating by the FDA? This will be important to clarify going forward. For example, if there is a site doing sample analysis, will they still fall under the FDA description of participating in research and be subject to IRB review when they wouldn't otherwise be for common rule regulated research? A couple of other important questions around how this will be applied in the future. Who is going to determine if a site is participating, meeting that description of participating? Is the IRB of record going to be the one making that call, or is the local site going to be the one making that call? That isn't clear from the proposed regulatory language at present. And what if a study is subject to both HHS and FDA regulations, including all sites that are engaged and participating. If there are going to be differences there, how are sites going to be affected, and how are IRBs of record going to manage that? And further to the point around the use of FDA exceptions, some questions that come to mind from our review is, who is going to determine that an exception can be used or is applicable? And who is going to be making the initial IND exempt or IDE exempt or not non-significant risk determination for a multi-site study when multiple parties or sites may be involved? And how are these decisions going to be communicated to other participating sites? And what if one of those sites disagrees with that determination? How will single IRB review of that research be managed in those cases? So certainly some important operational considerations and some questions around roles and responsibilities for making these determinations that are essentially left unanswered at present in the language in the NPRM. And lastly, for this section, just in terms of potential impacts to IRBs and human research protection programs around the country, I will point out in closing for this section that the main areas of potentially needed change as we see it based on this NPRM, if it were to take effect, would be to IRB policies and procedures and to electronic systems at research institutions that are involved in participating in FDA regulated multi-site research for which single IRB review is required. So that wraps up this section of the webinar. I think I want to turn things back over to Michael. I know we have a series of polling questions we want to deliver now to get everyone's first impressions about this NPRM and what they're hearing so far today.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. We have several polls coming up. I'm going to launch the first one. I think, Brandy, you can go to the next slide, but I'll launch it as well. So in this poll, we want to get your feedback about the volume on your IRB reviews. So if these changes go into effect, how will this affect the volume of your IRB reviews? So significantly decreasing your reviews if you review all FDA regulated, slight decrease if you have sort of a hybrid, moving down towards, slight increase if you might have to serve as this single IRB, or a significant increase if you think you may have to serve as the central IRB for a lot of FDA studies.
While the answers are coming in, I'll just mention to the audience, because I just had to do this myself. If you can't see the whole answer option, you can manually grab the window that popped up and expand it a bit, just so you can see the full list of options here.
And I think our answers have slowed down. Well, let's just give a few more minutes for everybody to jump in. We've got some changes coming, so I'm going to hold off for just a minute. Let a few more answers come in. All right, let me go ahead and thank you, everybody. I'm going to end this poll and we'll share the results here. So kind of a mix, right? Sort of slight increase, slight decrease, but there are a few people who feel like there will be a pretty significant change on either end in the increase or decrease.
Interesting in this one, the number of the second most popular answer. So a number of respondents indicating they think that their institution would likely be the one that would be that IRB of record on behalf of other institutions for FDA regulated cooperative studies. So interesting that it's really centered around some thinking a slight decrease and some thinking that they would be witnessing a slight increase in their workloads.
I'll thank everybody, and we'll move on to the next poll, which would be the single IRB impact. Let me launch this one. So if these regulations go into effect, how would this affect your institution? Do you think it's likely that you would serve as a single IRB? Unlikely, not. Still got a few answers coming in. We'll wait just another minute before we end this one. All right, I think we have most of the answers there. So let me end this and we'll share the results. So we see the top answer is not likely that this would have, that your institution would serve as a single IRB. That would be the top answer. A lot of likely answers, but then we see pretty large number of respondents saying that they would definitely serve as the single IRB for FDA cooperative research. All right, let's move on, excuse me, Brandy, to the next slide. We'll talk about policies and procedures. So if the NPRM is implemented, how impactful would this be to your institution's policy and procedure framework? Would you need major changes, moderate changes, minor changes, or you think your policies and procedures would be effective as is? All right, I think we have the majority of the answers here, so let's look and see. Pretty even split between moderate and minor changes, so that's probably to be expected. I think then we see just a few people who think major changes would be needed at their institution for their policies and procedures.
And worth noting that nobody thought that no changes are needed to their policies and procedures as well. Yeah, I know that the polling questions for the webinar today are really just centered around the FDA's Cooperative Research NPRM, but for those of you who attended our webinar on the first NPRM from a couple of weeks ago, we asked some questions specific to that NPRM as well around anticipated impact for policy and procedure changes, and it did see, if memory serves, some fairly similar answers, sort of a mix of moderate and minor changes to policies and procedures that people anticipate. Probably not the volume of changes that people anticipated back when the revised common rule took effect several years ago. But still, definitely at least some work to do to stay compliant if these regulations, if these proposed regulations do end up taking effect.
Just two more questions here for the group. We want to talk about, as we mentioned, systems impact. So the question being, how, if the NPRM is implemented, how would this impact your current electronic systems? Do you think you would need major changes, moderate changes, minor changes, or no changes? Or do you not use an electronic system? And I think we have a good number of respondents here. So sort of a pretty nicely shaped bell curve here with some minor changes in the middle being the most common answer, no changes or moderate changes being the next most popular answer, and only just a few people needing major changes, and just a few people who don't use an electronic system.
And across the board, majority here among institutions that do have an electronic system have at least some system change. To the extent that this will be a heavier lift or a more minor one, it sounds like it's varies a bit, with most people thinking that this will be fairly straightforward and a minor change, but still at least some changes to our software systems that will need to be put into effect.
Okay, and lastly, just want to get some input on the implementation period and the feasibility of making that 1 year implementation goal for these changes if they do go into effect. Do you think you could easily implement the changes? Would be challenging but feasible, or do you think that it would be not feasible to meet that 1 year goal of implementing these changes? Just one more minute. Okay. So I think this is a good sign. Most people think that they could easily implement the changes within 1 year, so that's promising to see. Got a fair number that think it would be challenging but feasible, but good to see that just a few people don't think that it would be able to happen within 1 year.
And based on the polls that or the information you've all provided from the prior questions, recognizing that the size of the lift here to get up to speed with these new regulations, if they take effect, most folks thinking that this was somewhere in the moderate to minor category, sort of, suggests that there aren't any major surprises here, that we think the implementation period of 1 year would be sufficient time in general to be able to get these changes in place.
Yeah, thank you everybody for answering those questions. That's good information for us to have. Moving on to next steps, we just want to call out that the comment period is open, and it's open till November 28th. So you'll note here that we have some information about how to submit your comments to the agency about these, and we do encourage everyone to consider these proposed changes and submit your comments to the FDA. Next slide, please. And just want to point out here, we have some links to the actual, to both of the NPRMs, the human subjects and the Cooperative Research NPRM that we talked about today. Also noting that we have a link here to the 21st Century Cures Act, which is the impetus for this harmonization action. On that, I'll turn it back over to you, Brandy.
Great, thanks, Michael. So now is a time, if you have questions, please do let us know. I do see a question of these slides will be sent out to attendees, and they will, we will also be posting these to our website in the coming. Okay, well, we will, let's see here. Like the industry sponsor gets to pick the single IRB. What happens if the sponsor chooses Coast IRB?
Does everyone, I'm not going to take for granted that everybody on the webinar knows who Coast IRB is, but for those who don't remember, that was a commercial IRB that got caught up in a sting operation and shut down, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 years ago. That I like the question, a little bit tongue in cheek. I don't know that it's clear from the information in the NPRM. There isn't an obvious exception here around, for example, compliance concerns. However, at the same time, I would also presume that sponsors likely don't have an interest in going with an IRB that's going to get them in non-compliance hot water later. So I would assume some degree of due diligence, and would assume, as we have already seen over the last 12, 15 years, just an emerging preference for relying on institutions that are AHRP accredited, institutions that are able to demonstrate that they're compliant with the regulations, that would continue to be the path forward, hopefully.
Another question, will existing studies be grandfathered?
So
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so if you look in the NPRM, the FDA does say in the implementation portion and the proposed effective date portion of the NPRM that the compliance date would only be effective for those studies initially approved on or after the effective date, the proposed effective date. So ongoing cooperative research that was approved by the IRB prior to that date would be allowed to follow the SIRB cooperative research provision, but not required. So you would have the choice in that particular scenario.
Thanks, Maddie.
Sure.
I see another question coming through asking whether we are aware of any updates from the legislative letter that Senator Elizabeth Warren had sent regarding an expressed intent to investigate or monitor commercial IRB oversight. That is a good question. If someone else on the line is aware of any updates after that initial letter was sent, I'd be interested in hearing it myself. I'm not aware of any updates since that letter got sent out. I'll go ahead and jump in here. I see a couple of other questions that have come up as well. Another attendee asks, do you think industry sponsors are likely to rely more heavily on commercial IRBs rather than local IRBs? Yes, I think that is probably likely. They're doing that presently. Many organizations already experience industry sponsors indicating a preference for use of a particular commercial IRB for an industry sponsored study. From what we've seen across the landscape, most organizations do take advantage of that, essentially using that as an opportunity for one fewer study that is on the IRB office's workload to manage from that point forward. I am aware that there are still some organizations around the country that have preferred to date to continue to maintain local IRB oversight of that study, even if other sites have ceded oversight to, say, Avara or WCG. I would expect to see less of that and more increase on some of those IRBs as the single IRB of record going forward.
I see one more of a statement that requiring AHRP accreditation, IRBs or HRPPs may be a good comment to submit to the FDA. Obviously, some institutions do have that requirement for reliance. So that is a consideration if that you do have that policy at your institution.
Good point. It's already institutional policy anyway at many places.
Another question, will participating sites be allowed to conduct a local context review for non-IRB related issues? There's nothing that I saw that would prevent that, and because that seems to be a common practice already, given the revised common rule collaborative research requirement, I don't see anything that would negate that.
Yeah, certainly worth maybe noting while we're on this topic that going back to the theme around defined terms that we talked about earlier in the section, the idea of a local context review isn't necessarily a term that means the same thing at every organization. So worth noting here that while some organizations may be checking to make sure that certain state laws are effectively addressed or acknowledged in the submission to be reviewed by an external IRB, others may take that much further and consider a local context review to almost rise to the level of being a duplicative IRB review. The NPRM doesn't say anything one way or another about that. Certainly, the theme of the NPRM is centered around the same concept we heard back with the NIH single IRB policy, and the same concept that we heard with the revised common rule, that that multiple duplicative IRB reviews add administrative burden and have not clearly increased or improved human research protections, and hence the stated goal of really minimizing those duplicative reviews. So when we're talking about a local context review, is it something like the Smart IRB network, where we have a standard set of considerations that we want to have on the books? What are our state law issues that our partner IRBs need to be aware of? What is our mandated research related injury language that our legal counsel requires be included in our informed consent documents? Are those things included, or are we thinking about something much more broadly? You think the spirit of the NPRM would be to discourage something too broad?
Another question, the NIH single IRB mandate allows for single IRB fees to be billed to the grant. Do you think this FDA NPRM would allow for single IRB fees? And the answer to that is yes. The FDA doesn't conduct or sponsor the research, so there's nothing in their collaborative research NPRM that would prevent the continued billing of the sponsor for single IRB fees.
Any other questions we haven't already covered?
I just did want to say that there was another question in the chat that I know I typed the answer to, and I know we have a minute or so, but this was a question that came up around why the FDA used the term participating versus engaged. And the NPRM gives some clue in terms of that FDA is just saying it's consistent with the use in the regulations. We also know from some correspondence that we had with FDA when we were updating our engagement worksheet and information was that FDA doesn't have a comparable process to OHRP because the regulations govern sponsors, investigators, and IRBs, not institutions or organizations like HHS does. So that's probably another likely reason for the different terminology that's used by FDA. But again, it's not defined anywhere, so it may be helpful if you're thinking of providing comment back to provide information to say that could be a useful definition to have, especially for SIRBs to be able to make the call as to whether or not someone's required to rely or not.
Oh, we had
We're right at the top of the hour, but I did see there's one last question that came through. Maybe I can take this one and then we can wrap up. There's a question of, why is this an NPRM and not an ANPRM, since the FDA hasn't even proposed a dispute resolution mechanism for review and comment? Good question. It was my understanding back when the DHHS advanced notice of proposed rulemaking came out, and I could be wrong, but it was my understanding at the time that ANPRMs are a little less typical than NPRMs. For many of us who have been in the IRB space for 5, 10, 15, 20 years even, that ANPRM was like our first exposure to a substantial regulatory change. But I think in general, NPRMs are more common than ANPRMs. It was an extra step that isn't always taken.
And I'm just going to chime in. I think that probably is also from a time perspective as well. I think that the clock is ticking off of the requirement in the Cures Act to get alignment and harmonization. So that's probably why we're not seeing the NPRM process.
Okay, we'll be making the recording available to our website. We'll be in touch via email. Thank you everyone for your participation today. And that concludes the webinar.
Thank you.